So here's something that happened a few weeks ago. Out on the open ocean, far from any coastline, the United States moved to intercept a single oil tanker. The ship was suspected of carrying oil linked to Iran and Venezuela, both under U.S. sanctions. The Coast Guard was dispatched. A federal seizure warrant had already been issued. The operation wasn't symbolic. It involved ships, crews, and sustained tracking over international waters. For years, sanctions enforcement has often been criticized as inconsistent, announced loudly, applied selectively, and avoided when it becomes inconvenient. This time, the action looked different. There was no press conference, no dramatic declaration, just a quiet, methodical pursuit. From a distance, it looked straightforward. A sanctioned vessel identified, authorities asserting jurisdiction, assets deployed to enforce existing law. The tanker was followed closely, kept under constant observation, and prevented from continuing its intended route. If you were inclined to see this as a sign of renewed seriousness, there was plenty to point to. A government acting, not talking. Rules being enforced rather than debated. A reminder that access to global trade routes still depends on compliance. At first glance, this appeared to be a clear demonstration of control, and if the story ended there, it would be easy to leave it at that. However, that initial impression didn't hold for very long, because the tanker did not stop. It did not respond to instructions to prepare for boarding. It did not alter course back toward port. It simply continued moving, maintaining speed and direction day after day while being followed at a distance. Then partway through the pursuit, the situation changed in a way that few sanctions cases ever do. The crew altered the appearance of the ship itself. A Russian flag was painted directly onto the hull. Shortly afterward, the vessel appeared in Russia's Maritime registry under a new name with a Russian port listed as its home. Not long after that, Moscow stepped in formally. Russian officials delivered a diplomatic message to Washington requesting that the pursuit be halted. None of this involved force. No confrontation occurred on deck. No boarding took place. But the meaning of the encounter shifted. What had begun as a seemingly routine enforcement action was no longer confined to the technical details of sanctions law or maritime procedure. It now carried diplomatic weight. At that point, the question was no longer simply whether the United States had the authority to act. On paper, much of that authority remained unchanged. The more relevant question became what happens when enforcement triggers consequences elsewhere. When a single operational decision begins to intersect with broader political relationships, and when applying pressure in one area quietly reshapes incentives in another. That is where the surface story starts to break down and where the real implications begin. This is the point where it helps to slow down and ask a different kind of question. Not who is right, not who looks strong, and not whether the rules were technically followed. The more useful question is what actually changes behind the scenes when something like this happens. On the surface, very little appears to move. The sanctions remain in place. The Coast Guard still has legal authority. The vessel's status at the start of the pursuit is still contested under existing maritime rules. None of that disappears. But systems don't operate on paper alone. They operate through choices made by people who have to manage risk, cost, and consequence in real time. Once Russia formally associated itself with that ship, the environment shifted. Not dramatically, but materially. A boarding decision was no longer just a question of procedure. It now carried diplomatic implications. A seizure was no longer a narrow enforcement step. It became a potential trigger for escalation beyond the original issue. At that point, the tanker itself mattered less than what it represented. The situation introduced a new variable into the system, the involvement of another major power willing to absorb some of the political cost. For anyone who has spent time running a business, maintaining infrastructure, or managing complex operations, this will sound familiar. When outside conditions change, processes don't fail all at once. They adjust. Decisions get deferred. Margins narrow. Risk tolerance shifts. The core issue here is not the fate of a single vessel. It's whether enforcement mechanisms continue to function the same way once incentives and constraints are altered. That's the question worth paying attention to. To understand why this episode matters, it helps to step away from the ship itself and look at how sanctions actually work in practice. Sanctions are often talked about as if they are switches on or off, applied or lifted, enforced or ignored. In reality, they behave much more like systems of friction. They slow things down, they raise costs, they narrow options, and they rely heavily on a small number of pressure points. Those pressure points are not abstract. They're very concrete. Ports that refuse entry, banks that won't clear payments, insurers that won't cover cargo, registries that won't certify ships, and compliance departments that decide what risk they're willing to carry. For a long time, most of those points lined up in the same direction. Not because the United States forced them to, but because participation in global trade required access to Western financial systems, Western insurance markets, and Western legal frameworks. If you wanted to move large volumes of oil, you needed shipping insurance. If you wanted insurance, you needed a recognized registry. And if you wanted recognition, you generally had to play by a common set of rules. That alignment created leverage, quiet leverage, the kind that doesn't need to be exercised often because everyone understands where the boundaries are. But alignment is not the same thing as permanence. As the global system becomes more fragmented, those pressure points don't disappear. They shift. Some weaken. Some move. Some get duplicated elsewhere. What the tanker episode shows is not open defiance of the system, but a careful adjustment to it. The operators didn't challenge the legality of sanctions in court. They didn't argue publicly about international law. They didn't try to overpower enforcement. Instead, they introduced uncertainty. By bringing another major state into the picture, they raised the cost of action without having to block it outright. They didn't need to win. They only needed to make enforcement harder to justify relative to other priorities. That's a familiar pattern in complex systems. If you've ever dealt with supply chains, you know that you don't shut down a competitor by attacking their factory directly. You disrupt a supplier. You complicate logistics. You increase paperwork. You introduce delays that ripple outward. Eventually, people upstream start making different decisions, not because the rules changed, but because the environment did. That's what's happening here. Sanctions evasion networks have learned that the law itself is not the weakest link. The weakest link is the moment when enforcement decisions stop being routine and start becoming political. As long as boarding a vessel is treated as a technical matter, it's relatively straightforward. Once it becomes a diplomatic incident, every actor involved has more to consider. Commanders have to think about escalation. Officials have to think about unrelated negotiations. Allies have to think about alignment and precedent. None of that requires public announcements. It happens quietly inside decision-making processes. And once one group demonstrates that this tactic works, that attaching a powerful name to an otherwise isolated problem raises the cost of action, others will notice. They don't need to coordinate openly. They don't need to declare anything. They just need to observe outcomes. If enforcement becomes slower, more cautious, or more selective, that information spreads quickly through informal channels. This is how systems adapt without anyone saying they are adapting. Another useful analogy comes from insurance. Insurers don't stop writing policies overnight. They adjust premiums. They add exclusions. They change coverage terms in response to risk. Eventually, entire categories of activity become harder to insure, not because they're illegal, but because the risk is harder to price. Sanctions enforcement works the same way. It depends on predictability. When outcomes become unpredictable, fewer actors are willing to take part without compensation. That doesn't mean enforcement collapses. It means it becomes uneven. Some cases move forward. Others get delayed. Some are avoided altogether in favor of easier targets. Over time, this reshapes behavior. Shipping routes change. Transfer points move. Ownership structures become more opaque. Protection strategies become more sophisticated. None of this requires a press release. From the outside, it can look like nothing has changed. The sanctions are still on the books. The authority still exists. The rhetoric remains firm. But underneath, incentives are shifting. And systems respond to incentives, not statements. It's also important to understand that this kind of adaptation is not limited to adversaries. Allies adjust too. Companies operating in allied countries watch these cases closely. So do insurers, port authorities, and logistics firms. They take note of where enforcement becomes complicated and where it remains straightforward. Over time, that influences where capital flows, where infrastructure investments go, and which routes are favored. This is not a failure of law. It's a reflection of how interconnected systems behave when pressure increases unevenly. In a more centralized world, pressure could be applied cleanly because alternatives were limited. In a more distributed world, pressure creates branching paths. The tanker episode illustrates that shift very clearly. It shows that enforcement is no longer just about authority. It's about whether applying that authority produces more stability than instability elsewhere. And when enforcement decisions begin to intersect with larger strategic relationships, the system adapts to minimize friction, quietly, incrementally, without anyone declaring a change in policy. That's the structural story behind the headlines. And it's the part that tends to matter long after the immediate event fades from view. The most important consequences of this episode are unlikely to appear in any official statement or breaking news alert. They will show up later and in subtler ways. They will show up in how shipping companies evaluate risk. Operators will quietly reassess which routes are worth taking and which situations introduce complications that are difficult to manage. Not because a rule changed, but because uncertainty increased. They will show up in insurance contracts. Coverage terms will be adjusted. Exclusions will be clarified. Premiums will shift to reflect the possibility that enforcement actions can escalate into diplomatic incidents. These changes won't attract attention, but they will influence which voyages are commercially viable. They will show up in how sanctions targets plan their movements. Routes will be modified. Transfer points will be reconsidered. Strategies will evolve based on what appears to work and what draws sustained attention. And they will show up inside enforcement agencies themselves. No memo needs to be issued for this to happen. People remember past cases. Commanders and planners internalize where decisions became complicated, where resources were tied up for long periods, and where outcomes were uncertain. That experience shapes future judgment. Once a precedent exists, every similar decision is made in its shadow. If a major power can provide effective cover once it becomes a factor in future calculations, if that tactic proves reliable, others will test it. Not immediately and not in identical ways, but gradually. This is how erosion occurs in complex systems. Not through collapse, but through accumulation. Assets are stretched a little thinner. Pursuits last a little longer. Decisions take a little more time. Some cases are quietly deprioritized in favor of simpler ones. None of these changes are dramatic on their own, but together they alter the balance. What makes these shifts difficult to reverse is that they become embedded in routine practice. Once insurers price in new risk, those assumptions don't disappear easily. Once operators adapt to a new environment, reverting requires confidence that conditions have genuinely changed. Restoring predictability takes longer than losing it. That's why the most lasting effects of moments like this are often invisible at first. By the time they become obvious, they are no longer isolated decisions. They are part of the system. And systems once adjusted tend to keep moving in the same direction. This situation may feel unusual, but the underlying pattern is familiar. We've seen it before in other areas where pressure was applied through complex systems rather than direct force. Take financial sanctions. When access to major Western banking networks was restricted, the immediate effect appeared decisive. Transactions were blocked. Accounts were frozen. The message was clear, but over time, alternatives emerged. Payments were rerouted through smaller banks. New clearing arrangements developed. Settlement times grew longer and less efficient, but activity continued. The system adapted not all at once, but steadily. The same pattern showed up in payment infrastructure. When certain platforms became unavailable, new mechanisms didn't replace them overnight. Instead, workarounds accumulated. Regional systems expanded. Bilateral arrangements multiplied. None of them matched the efficiency of the original networks, but they reduced dependence enough to change behavior. Supply chains followed a similar path. Trade restrictions initially caused sharp disruptions. Factories paused. Costs rose. Attention focused on the immediate shock. Then, adjustments began. Sourcing shifted. Inventories increased. Routes diversified. Over time, what started as an exception became routine. The system didn't return to its previous state, it settled into a new one. In each of these cases, the early phase looked strong. Enforcement was visible. Authority was asserted. But the long-term outcome was shaped less by the initial action than by how participants adjusted afterward. What mattered was not whether enforcement existed, but whether it remained predictable, scalable, and relatively low risk to apply. Once enforcement became case-specific, requiring careful calibration each time its effectiveness changed. That doesn't mean it stopped working. It means it worked differently. Decisions became more selective. Resources were allocated more cautiously. The focus shifted toward managing consequences rather than simply applying rules. This is the recurring logic. Pressure introduces incentives. Incentives drive adaptation. Adaptation produces new norms, and those norms persist even if the original pressure remains in place. The tanker episode fits cleanly into that pattern, not as an exception, but as another example of how systems respond when constraints tighten unevenly. Understanding that history doesn't tell us what will happen next, but it does help explain why the surface story is rarely the whole one. What this episode ultimately illustrates is a quieter shift in how power operates. Power today is less about the ability to issue commands and more about the ability to keep systems functioning smoothly. Sanctions are most effective when they are routine, when enforcement is predictable, and when resistance remains isolated. They work best when they fade into the background of normal operations. What happened here did the opposite. Enforcement became visible. It became complicated. And it became costly in ways that extend beyond the immediate case. That does not mean authority vanished or that rules no longer apply. It means the surrounding environment has changed. In a more fragmented world, leverage depends less on dominance and more on alignment, on how many institutions, markets, and partners continue to move in the same direction without needing constant intervention. The tanker itself remains at sea. The pursuit continues. At some point, a decision will be made and an outcome recorded, but the most important result is not waiting in the future. It has already occurred. A signal was sent through behavior rather than words. A demonstration of how easily a narrow enforcement action can intersect with broader relationships and how quickly incentives adjust in response. In international politics, those signals tend to matter more than formal statements. They shape expectations, they influence planning, and they quietly alter what others assume is possible. That is how power expresses itself now, not in moments of declaration, but in the accumulation of small constraints and adaptations over time.